Thanks for downloading Analysis. What excellent taste you have in podcasts. Rosie Campbell is a professor of politics and used to dealing with complicated questions. But this week she tries to answer a deceptively simple one. How do voters decide?
Election results have been taking us to unexpected places recently. Pundits have become increasingly wary of predicting the future. Quite right too, some might say. But we cannot hope to understand what voters might do next without answering one simple question. Confronted with a ballot paper, how do we decide what to do?
A political theorist would say, well, in order for government in a democracy to work, citizens have to be voting, sending signals to government about what policies they want to have passed and what policies they do not want to have passed.
Professor John Krosnick from Stanford University lays out the classical theory of how elections are meant to work. Democracy is supposed to be about dialogue and deliberation. We're meant to come to collective decisions about which policies would work best for all of us. And to do this, voters ought to be fully informed and have an open mind. But how many of us can really claim this to be true?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're now approaching Sleaford. Sleaford Station will be our next stop.
I went to Sleaford, a market town in rural Lincolnshire, where the residents were deciding how to vote in a by-election taking place the next day. I asked the people I met how they were deciding who to vote for.
Good question. Yeah. I think just on the current policies and the views on certain things.
Immigration, innit? It's immigration, really, innit? Let's be honest about it.
We want someone who's going to look after the people and not someone who's going to look after their own pockets, don't we, really?
It's immigration.
Someone that's from round here and not just like making their own views about what's in town is. We need to realise what the people are going through and how much the struggle is.
There's a whole host of different things that people take on board when making that decision.
Joe Twyman is head of political and social research at the polling company YouGov.
Who do they trust? Who do they think can be effective? Who do they think is best on subjects like the economy or education, tax, immigration, for instance? What they're not really interested, though, is the minutiae. They're not really paying attention to the specifics of economic policy, to the small details of immigration bills. Instead, it's broad ideas.
The problem is that according to classic theory, the ideal voter would read the specifics of policy and would be interested in the minutiae. And if we're not basing our decisions on policy, then what are we doing? James Tilley, Professor of Politics at the University of Oxford, says that most of us do something very human. We look around us and vote in pretty much the same way as everyone else like us. Doesn't sound like there's much room for rationality in that process.
No.
In some.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not necessarily irrational. If I'm in a particular social class, I regularly vote for a particular party because that party is generally good for people in my class. I think that's quite a rational response. I don't need a lot of information. I don't need to go and collect lots of information what all the policy options are for all the different parties. I just kind of know there's a couple of parties out there. One party's kind of a bit better for me and the other party's a bit better for the other lot. And so I'll vote for the party that's a bit better for me.
Who are you going to vote for?
Conservative.
And have you voted for Conservatives in the past?
As long as I can remember.
Your whole life?
I was even a member of the Young Conservatives years ago.
Apparently that was a lot of fun in the old days, wasn't it?
Well, it must have been. I've almost forgotten now. But
So what's made you be a lifelong Conservative supporter?
Well, because I'm an independent person and I rather like I don't like everything, of course. There are things I'm not too keen on, but by and large.
Throughout your life, they've always been the party that you've...
They have, yes.
Did your family
supported.
support Conservatives?
Do you know, I don't ask a lot of questions, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. And when you were growing up, did your parents or...?
My parents did, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was that important to you?
Well, I suppose it was really. It was a bit of a tradition, really. But, I mean, I do like their policies.
Sorry to put you on the spot. Dr. Oliver Heath from Royal Holloway, University of London, has done a great deal of research on how our social class influences our voting behaviour. Is this still an important factor shaping how we vote?
It's still important. It's not as important as it used to be, and there's been a big decline, but it still makes a difference.
In 2015, 41% of what political scientists call the working class, social groups D and E, voted Labour. That was way down from the high point in the immediate post-war period. In 1964, for example, 64% of labourers voted Labour. Did this link between being working class and voting Labour reflect an informed choice, or was it simply blind allegiance?
Labour during that period had a very strong social identity. It was a party that was made up of the working class. There are a large number of working class MPs within the party, and a party that explicitly stood for working class interests. But if we look at the differences in terms of ideology or policy between Labour and Conservatives, there wasn't a great deal of polarisation during that period of the 60s and 70s. You think about it as being almost a consensual time.
So there was a great deal of class voting at a time when there wasn't a great deal of policy difference between the parties.
The parties then begin to move away from each other during the 70s and the 80s. And so at this time, parties are becoming more distinctive in political terms. But class, if anything, is declining as an electoral cleavage.
Perhaps it made sense for Labourers to vote Labour back when both parties were offering very similar policies. Voters had to have some basis on which to decide, and so they looked at the class identity of the parties. Labour had a strong working class identity. Of course, class is not the only factor that voters consider.
If we were sat here in France or Italy, then it'd be quite a simple story to tell. Something like, well, Catholics vote for the party on the right and non-Catholics vote for party on the left. And that's relatively a straightforward connection because we say, well, the party on the right's a bit more socially conservative and that appeals a bit more to practising Catholics, to religious people.
James Tilley tells me that in the UK, the story is the reverse. 57% of practising Catholics in England support our left-wing party and not the party on the right, the opposite to what happens on mainland Europe. Meanwhile, there's such a strong correlation between Anglicanism and our right-wing party that the Church of England has been nicknamed the Tory party at prayer. Anglicans are twice as likely to vote Conservative as they are to vote Labour. Why are our religious affiliations the opposite of those in mainland Europe?
The reasons for that are complex, but they're mainly rooted in early 20th century history. So most Catholics are descended from working class Irish immigrants. And the Labour Party explicitly mobilised Catholics as the party grew way back in the first part of the last century. And so that's related to issues of Irish Home Rule, but it's also the fact that Catholics were predominantly working class and they're therefore very likely to support that new workers' party.
The historical link made sense when Catholics were recent immigrants and likely to be working class. But why does it persist today? After all, you might expect the more socially conservative Catholics to be more at home with the Conservative Party.
There's many fewer people that are religious today than there were in the past. So the parents that are successful at influencing their children in adopting their religion are also probably the same kind of parents that are successful in indoctrinating their children into a party identity as well.
I'm really interested in this stickiness you describe of both religion and party loyalty.
When you grow up, the kind of information you get from your parents is likely to be rather biased about politics. It's going to be biased in the favour of whatever they think. And so that biased information is going to have some impact on how you see the world as you grow up. I guess there's also a conformity aspect. It's a lot easier just to go along with what other people around you are saying than it is to be the rebel. And then by the time you've voted, maybe in your first election or second election, you're tied in to some extent to that party. Most people don't like to think they've did stupid things in the past, so they're likely to want to reaffirm that identity, that loyalty to that party by going out and voting for them again. And by the time you've done that a few more times, then it becomes perhaps part of your identity as well, that you're a Labour person or a Conservative voter or whatever it is. And therefore, if that's part of your identity, it becomes quite difficult to change that.
Do it the hard way and it's easy sailing.
So far, we haven't mentioned whether our views are of the left or the right. Is that because this does not really matter anymore? Jane Green, Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester, is co-director of the British election study, the Gold Standard Survey of UK Voters.
People's views tend to be easily organised into left and right, then we would see that as a dominant dimension. But what if people who have left views are really anti-Europe, and people who have right views could be pro-European? That means that left-right divide doesn't really divide people as well. We'd need to think about another dimension, another set of attitudes that aren't aligning very well with left-right.
So we could think about our attitudes as having more than one dimension. For example, as well as working out how economically left or right-wing we are, we could also try to work out how socially liberal or socially conservative we are. Bear with me and be prepared to use your imagination. Picture a line going from top to bottom on a piece of paper. At the top are the very socially liberal, and at the bottom are the most socially conservative. Our left and right economic views then go from left to right across the page. I challenged James Tilley to work out where he would place Tory grandees Anne Widdecombe and Ken Clarke.
Anne Widdecombe would be socially conservative, so she wants to restrict abortion rights. She's not in favour of gay marriage, I believe. And she's also relatively economically right-wing, low tax, low spending.
Anne Widdecombe would sit towards the bottom for her social conservatism, and she would be on the economic right. That means we would find her in the bottom right-hand section.
Ken Clarke, on the other hand, I think would be equally economically right-wing, but more socially liberal.
Ken Clarke is also on the right, but as a social liberal he would sit in the top right-hand section. Where would we place former Labour Party leaders James Callaghan and Neil Kinnock?
Callaghan is very much what we might describe as old Labour, I think, socially conservative, but also at the same time economically left-wing. Actually a position that most people in the country hold overall, whereas someone like Kinnock would probably be a bit more socially liberal, but equally economically left-wing.
Callaghan and Kinnock are both economically left-wings. They would both go on the left side, but we would place Callaghan on the bottom left and Kinnock on the top left. So does that mean that Jim Callaghan and Anne Widdecombe, both in the bottom half, have more in common than we realise? Thinking about the way these politicians' attitudes combine illustrates the tensions that the parties face now. The economic left-right dimension is receding in importance relative to new divides, such as attitudes to the EU or the impact of globalisation. So how do we decide which dimension or issue is most important to us? If a voter is socially conservative, is that more important than the fact they are economically left-wing? These are the kinds of questions that are really salient at the moment. Parties play a key role here. They can attempt to shift our focus away from the old economic left-right divide and towards something else. Jane Green.
When Tony Blair took over the Labour Party and really transformed the image of the Labour Party, made it far more economically liberal and more centrist, then that actually diminished this issue of left and right, because it just wasn't being talked about. It wasn't being made the kind of politically relevant choice.
Once economic left-right has become less important to us, politicians can then draw our attention to the issues that suit them most. Caitlin Milazzo, Associate Professor in Politics at the University of Nottingham, has been charting the rise of the UK Independence Party, which sought to move away from being seen as a single-issue party.
One of the strategies that Nigel Farage took prior to the 2014 European election was to recognize that that message of Europe alone simply wasn't enough to bolster support for the party. And so what he has done is fused the issue of Europe with the issue of immigration. And so that has had the effect of broadening the party's base, of picking up people who perhaps weren't necessarily concerned quite so much about the EU, but were very much concerned about the perceived negative effects of immigration and the changing landscape of the countryside.
So Farage fused two dimensions and in doing so attracted more voters. These two stances, anti-immigration and anti-EU, are now so entwined that it's hard to separate them. Could we imagine a party opposing the EU while calling for more immigration? Even if some politicians might secretly find that attractive. Another realignment has taken place in Scotland. James Tilley.
In Scotland, there's another now most important dimension in politics, which is the national question. Are you a unionist or do you want independence? And because of the referendum, that became the dominant issue. That changed political debates. It changed how people thought of themselves because they had to go and cast a vote to either stay in the UK or to leave. And that realignment meant that competition now in Scottish politics is really between the unionists and the nationalists. And you kind of see that in the extent to which the Conservative Party, as the predominantly unionist party, has actually experienced a bit of success in Scotland recently.
What we see with the increasing proportion of people voting for minor parties is the increasing importance of other issues, such as immigration, such as the environment, those issues that kind of tend to cross-cut those left-right divides.
Jane Green. The emergence of these issues has huge implications for elections. It's much harder to predict which issues a voter will prioritise. Will they vote according to their social or to their economic views? Or something else entirely? As a result, in places like Sleaford, we're now voting for parties we would never have dreamed of choosing in the past.
So, have you made up your mind how you're voting?
I have.
Do you want to share, or is it a private matter?
I'm voting Conservative to support Theresa May.
Right.
Because I want Brexit to go through. Years and years and years I used to vote Labour because of workers' rights and things like that. But, you can move, switch about.
Is this the first time you've switched?
Yes, yeah.
Next week we'll be devoting an entire programme to exploring how and why people change their minds. What makes us swing towards a new party? So far we have heard that many of us do still vote according to our class and religion, mirroring the people around us. But the rise of new issues, such as immigration, is causing us to question our allegiances. But before we get carried away sizing up these different factors, we should question our ability to make sound decisions in the first place. John Krosnick.
Psychologists have become increasingly interested in the idea of what they call motivated cognition. In other words, we don't look out at the world and see what's really there. So, for example, in the United States, some years ago, when a representative national sample of American adults were asked, what is the unemployment rate in America right now? This was at a time when Barack Obama was president, and at that time, Democrats overestimated the unemployment rate, but Republicans overestimated the unemployment rate even more, suggesting that Republicans say to themselves, well, look, we got a Democrat in the White House. Things can't be going well. It must be that things are bad. And whatever I think the unemployment rate might be, I'm going to adjust my perception a little bit upwards so I can feel good about it. So that's really an example where it looks like people may even intentionally, consciously or unconsciously, misperceive the world in a way that allows their beliefs to fit together comfortably.
A striking example of this took place recently. Pictures of Donald Trump's inauguration crowd dominated the news headlines for days. Trump claimed that his crowd was larger than Obama's had been. Researchers found that when Trump supporters were shown the images, they claimed to see a huge crowd in the pictures. But voters strongly opposed to Trump insisted that the pictures showed vast empty spaces. And Joe Twyman has been looking at this phenomenon in the UK.
YouGov worked with Professor Rob Ford from the University of Manchester, looking at an investigation into an extremely long-serving member of the civil service, specifically Humphrey, the Downing Street cat. Now, Humphrey was the Downing Street cat for part of Margaret Thatcher's reign, but also for John Major and even Tony Blair. And we ran an experiment asking people simply what they thought of Humphrey the cat, whether they approved or disapproved of him. And the results were largely uninteresting. But then we started attaching an identity to the cat. For half of the respondents, we said this is Margaret Thatcher's cat, and for another half, we said this is Tony Blair's cat. Now, once it became Margaret Thatcher's cat, support for Humphrey, the chief mouser of Downing Street, increased by 13% among Conservatives and fell by 10% among Labour supporters. However, among those Labour supporters, once you said it's Tony Blair's cat, support went up 10% and fell 16% from the Conservatives. So it's really interesting how people's views can be influenced so heavily by their partisan position. Now, that of course doesn't matter when it comes to people's view of a cat, but it's far more important when it comes to their views of, for instance, particular political policies.
John Krosnick and Joe Twyman have warned me that, just like everyone else, I'm likely to view the world through a distorted lens. I'm beginning to worry that despite my best intentions, my biases might have a major impact on the way I vote. To find out, I went along to Edinburgh University's Neuropolitics lab.
Throughout the experiment, if you can make sure your head is visible, essentially there. So try not to slump or move too much.
Okay.
Research fellow Dr. Robin Hill, a cognitive scientist based in this interdisciplinary department. By fitting me with headsets, switching on eye trackers, and gauging my response as I watch politicians in action, he is able to pick up on biases I may not even realise I have.
Here in the studio tonight are 7 party leaders with different visions for the future of our country. Over the next 2 hours...
So you've been recording my facial reactions. What kind of things would you expect to see? And would I be grinning or grimacing? What difference would that make?
Right, so what we're actually looking for are what we call very small micro-expressions. They're very momentary, but entirely unconscious, so that it gives us an insight into actually what you're thinking.
We tend to copy the expressions of the politicians we like and to frown imperceptibly at words we dislike. So he spotted me smiling at a politician I didn't even think I admired. Professor Laura Cram is the director of the Neuropolitics Lab.
Mostly we're really interested in finding implicit responses that you yourself might not be aware of. So if we ask you what your attitude is, so for example, very few people would ever tell you they're racist. But their physiological responses, their heart rates, what's going on in their brain, their hormonal responses might tell you a different story.
The research undertaken by the Neuropolitics Lab monitors our bodies for evidence of unconscious bias.
By doing these kind of experiments, if we can expose there are things that are affecting people that they weren't really aware of, then perhaps becoming a little more aware might make you a slightly better voter.
Laura Cram and her team were studying my physical reactions to find out how I am really feeling. John Krosnick explains how my feelings affect my vote choice. He tells me that I'm likely to be biased in favour of candidates who make me feel good.
Candidates who make voters feel optimistic and proud and happy are more likely to be supported than candidates who make voters feel fearful or angry or frustrated.
The emotional response we have to a candidate can even prevent us from voting altogether. He believes this had an impact in the recent US election. The exact turnout figures have not yet been calculated, but early forecasts suggest that turnout dropped by several million voters from 2012.
There was a lot of negativity, and that type of negativity works against voter turnout. Actually, you might think that it would motivate them to turn out, but when people are experiencing what psychologists call an avoid conflict, where they move a little bit toward Hillary, they say, no, I don't want her, then they move a little toward Trump, they say, oh, no, I don't want him, one solution is just walk away. Don't drink either of the milkshakes.
So emotions can actually make us decide not to decide. But politicians desperately want to make sure we do go out and vote. And in a week like this, with 2 by-elections coming up, candidates will be knocking on doors and trying to meet as many people as possible. But does face-to-face contact with a candidate create a bias in their favour?
Well, they hope it makes a great deal of difference.
Caitlin Milazzo.
We know from a long-established set of literature, particularly in this country, that being contacted by a party does increase the chances that you will vote for them. And that's particularly true amongst those who have much weaker ties to parties. So these are the people that parties are trying to reach and persuade to come to their banner.
Will you be voting tomorrow?
We've had nothing through the door, no one to speak to, nothing. So
that makes a big difference to you if someone's made the effort to contact you.
If someone's making the effort to actually get my vote, then obviously I'm going to go for that.
Marcus Wagner from the University of Vienna tells me how politicians harness the power of our emotional biases.
If you want to really get people to vote for you, then you really want to get them excited. That's the kind of thing that will move people to actually go to the polls and also perhaps convince neighbours and friends to change their vote as well.
And if this music makes you angry?
If you look at Brexit, or if you look at the Trump campaign, they managed to create a lot of anger towards the EU, towards illegal immigrants, and that anger is then also very good at mobilising voters.
But feeling motivated to rush out and vote is not the same as making a sensible, rational decision.
If you're angry or hopeful, that means you're also very convinced about the candidate or the party you're endorsing or you've chosen, and that any outside information will have a much tougher time at reaching you. So those emotions are actually much less conducive to this ideal type of decision-making.
Perhaps then that moment when we think we're at our closest to being a model democratic citizen, when we're motivated to rush out and vote for a party, could in fact be the moment when we're at our least thoughtful and our least open-minded. John Krosnick outlines a really well-tested bias with huge consequences. This one involves the tiny but crucial group of people who make it all the way into the ballot box without having made up their mind.
Those people, most likely without even being aware of it, are influenced by the first name listed on the ballot. And that has caused increases on average of about 3 percentage points for candidates across lots of races and states and years in America. And I'm sorry to tell you, because of the fact that different states in the U.S. order candidate names differently and idiosyncratically, and almost none of the states do what Ohio and California do, which is to rotate candidate name order across ballots, to be fair, that we have, unfortunately, I believe, had at least 2 recent election outcomes that are the result of bias in the name ordering. That is the election of George W. Bush as President of the United States in 2000, where in Florida he won by a very narrow margin, and his name was listed first on every ballot in Florida. And in the 2016 presidential race, in the states where Donald Trump won very narrowly, his name was also listed first on the ballot in most of those states. And if all of those states had rotated name order fairly, like Ohio and California, most likely George W. Bush would not have been elected president in 2000, nor would Donald Trump have been elected president in 2016.
How do we decide how to vote? Should we follow the example of our parents and vote the way they did, or find answers in our faith or our class identity? Should we prioritise the issues we care most about, even if that means abandoning the party we've backed for decades? Should we monitor our heart rate to check for implicit bias? And at the very least, should we insist that ballot papers are randomised?
Do it the hard way and it's easy sailing.
In case you were wondering, the by-election in Sleaford ended with the Conservatives holding their safe seat. That sounds straightforward, but on the streets it sounded a little more like this.
I'll probably be going towards Labour.
Okay, and do you always vote Labour? Or have you voted
I've gone Conservative before with David Cameron, but now I think with Theresa May, I don't know.
So you definitely are among the undecided.
I am completely among the
Back when most of us were loyal to a particular party, the decisions we made were much simpler. Lots of us are changing our minds from one election to the next, and this has huge implications for our democratic system. If we understood a little more about the way we switch allegiances, perhaps we would understand what's going on in politics right now. In the next episode, are we all swingers now?
Do it the hard way now that you want me.
Analysis was presented by Rosie Campbell and produced by Hannah Sander. Next week, we stick with Rosie as she finds out why so many voters are changing their minds. One more thing before you go. We've got a new podcast series called Murder in the Lucky Holiday Hotel. It's a juicy story of death, sex and elite Chinese politics, told by the BBC's China editor, Carrie Gracie. Here's a tease.
November the 16th, 2011.
We will handle this issue.
The British consulate in the southwest Chinese city of Chongqing receives a fax.
In strict accordance with law.
A 41-year-old British citizen has died.
He always said he'd have a throat cut if she made life difficult for him.
So although the Communist Party doesn't want us to tell this story,
the script for the trial has been written.
And although it's done its best to scare us off,
the sentence has already been agreed.
Here goes.
You can get Murder in the Lucky Holiday Hotel wherever you usually find your podcasts. And that really is all. Thanks for listening.